Oh, what's that? Can you? Yeah, I think we're good without a microphone, right? Okay, ready for chat. Mic check. So yeah, we're going to today just do a little overview of Ruby ecosystem, kind of an intro to the language. I'm not going to go too deeply into the language, just maybe compare it with some things you guys have already done. Talk a little bit about the framework Rails and how it's some different applications that we built with it, some different things that have happened, and then talk a little bit about Ruby in the cloud ecosystem and going forward with whether or not it's a good choice to learn, and a little bit about that. So I've been doing Ruby and Rails since 2012. I mostly did self-taught. At that time, the code schools weren't as well known. I didn't know about them anyway. So I did a lot of just online learning, and I've got some resources at the end I can share with you guys about some great online resources for learning Ruby and the Rails framework. I worked for a bunch of startups and watched some of them crash and burn, and some of them turned out all right. And then I really got my break working for these big corporate enterprises. I started over at Cambia Healthcare and built some. They have like an innovation department. They spin out a lot of new ideas in healthcare, and they use Ruby on Rails because it's so easy to get things to market quickly. Right? So with that work there, and then I've been the last few years working on a project for Verizon, and over time we've been using AWS services and got interested in deploying applications, mainly because at the beginning I was doing everything on my own with the deployments and setting up the servers and setting up the databases, and so continued to move in that, and then did a lot of through this last project, a lot of architecture design of the new system. So we have a suite of APIs, several different apps that talk to each other, several user interfaces, and then designing the networks and the security groups in the AWS cloud. So I just got my certification as a cloud solutions architect. But when it comes to Ruby, Rails, why should anyone care? I mean, it does actually get a bad rap. Everyone says it can't scale. It's one of the easiest apps or languages to learn, in my opinion. It's really easy to read and simple, but a really crazy thing happened last summer, and it was that Microsoft paid $7.5 billion for what was a Ruby on Rails application that scaled over time to become GitHub. So it obviously can scale. I think it's a matter of how it's done, and that people say it can't scale are just lacking in creativity. But it's a fun, easy language to learn, and it's a very productive language. So it comes from Japan. It was actually came in 1993, and it was written by this guy Yukuro Matsumoto, and he's still highly involved. He had been frustrated by the languages that he had been working with, and he wanted to make a pure object-oriented language that was fun to work with, and really did it as an academic exercise. It was never really intended to go into production, but it has evolved a lot over. What happened was essentially the Ruby on Rails was developed, and then everyone started using it, and then it was in production all over the place. And they've since evolved. The language has gotten a lot faster, a lot more capable, and now it's a lot better off. So, what's great about it? It's easy to read. You can look at Ruby code, and it looks a lot like English. You can define things as you would in English. There's very few surprises. There's not extra syntax, and objects are treated. Everything is an object, so everything's treated in a consistent way. For weaknesses, it's not as performant as your compiled languages, of course. So, and these two issues kind of come stay together, the concurrency and the type safety. But we'll talk about later on how to deal with that performance situation, and if you architect the systems right, and in my opinion, the way that new systems will be architected in the cloud environments, it becomes less of an issue. You can isolate places where you need the concurrency and isolate the type safety. I found this online from EduCA, and I thought it would be interesting because you've been working in Python, just to sort of look at those two side by side. They are very similar. I think the person who wrote this really knows Python well and not much about Ruby, so they seem to have the Python points right, but like for instance, functional programming is not something you do with Ruby. All of this seems like a good comparison of use cases. And this is a big point, that Ruby is very flexible. The Ruby community tends to be a lot of free spirits, a lot of like rebel types. I don't fit in that well, but it's capable of a lot of things and a lot of expressiveness, and there's many different ways to do each type of method, many different choices you can make. Although there are best practices, there are many different ways to do it. Expressive, elegant, used a lot. And these are some of the major applications that are built with it, which we'll get to a little bit more later. So, it's a pure object-oriented language, interpreted, dynamic, reflective, and let's dig into what those mean again. Just what is compiled versus interpreted again? I always think that it's good to just reiterate these sort of concepts from time to time. But you have your source code. You've probably done compiling with your C#. Have you been working C# lately? Or is it mostly been Python?
It's both.
It's both.
What they are, yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. So you can imagine that C# as it's compiled down into machine code, and then when it's executed by the machine, it just goes a lot faster. Whereas in Ruby, you have this interpreter which has to look at the code each time and decide what kind of variable is this, right? So it's slower, but it's still plenty fast for the type of applications that it's used for. But you're not able to do the type of things you can with compiled language in terms of concurrence. So there are these interpreters. There have been these different choices of people have tried to find ways to make it deal with concurrency and try to make it faster. Your default interpreter is the MRI. That's like if you fire up Ruby in most environments, you get into the console, you're in the master interpreter, and it's single-threaded. Uses quite a bit of RAM in comparison to their costs to the ease of use. I thought it's kind of interesting to just look at if you define number equals 4, right? If you just define a variable of 4, you can work your 4 is actually an object in the language, and you can kind of see it's works. If you work your way back up, it's a fixed num, which is class integer, which is of the numeric class, and then class inherits from module and object. So that kind of brings you all the way back to the core object class. And things are blowing away. This can go talking, but that's I mean, this is sort of a half-baked slide here. There's a lot to it, right? I don't want to dig too deeply into the language itself, because this is really intended to be an overview, kind of introduce to the ecosystem. So, but that would be a good thing for a class. They now offer certification for Ruby programmers, which they never did in the past, from the organization that founded and that the founders is involved with it. So, I'm planning to study for these certifications just for my own edification. And then we get on to Ruby gems. So a lot of the power from the Ruby ecosystem comes from this bundler library, which is like your package manager, like your pip or your apt for these libraries that you can use for your Ruby code. So you have the bundler, which can install these different libraries, and there's basically a gem for almost any situation you can think of. There's authentication gems and anything you really can think of is built with these libraries, which are little bundled parts of code, which are hosted on GitHub, or hosted on this Ruby Gems organization or GitHub. And they've become the foundation for the Rails application system. And so, as we kind of go into the Rails framework, just wanted to remind all the apps which were built on Rails in the last few years. There really have been some big things that came from Rails over the last decade or so, and it's a very productive framework. It allows you to get from 0 to 100 very fast, be the first one to market, and so it's used a lot when people have an app idea to get it running. And you can see these are all huge companies, right? So they build it with Rails, then they find ways to scale. Originally, they scale it horizontally, and then they model the domain and distribute it throughout the cloud. So it can be scaled in that way. So Rails, it was really a big. It started around 2003. It was a really big deal then, and everyone was doing it at that point. In some ways, people have moved on from it. It's not as big as it was at that time, but still, there are still a lot of jobs. People looking for Rails developers. Still, people with an idea that they want to get to market quickly. They'll build it in Rails. A lot of times, it has a great ecosystem of people, a lot of support, and a lot of different channels where you can ask questions, and people are very nice, and it's an easy place to develop your skills in the Rails framework. I definitely recommend it for those sort of things. One of the things you'll find in Rails is this idea of convention over configuration, and the menu is omakase. This is this Japanese idea that if you just went into a restaurant and you ordered what's on the menu, what would come out would be something good, right? So the things that you get from the framework are already well packaged. They don't surprise you. The things that you expect to be there are there, and it allows, because there's so much convention to it, there's a certain way that things are done within Rails. There's a lot of boilerplate you don't have to think about, and there's a lot of security ideas that you don't have to worry about, and you can sort of focus on your logic and your business logic and your expression of this application with this fast-moving, strong framework. And its model view controller, I think a lot of the model view controller diagrams that I see, I think are strange. This is how it works to me. You have your view. There's a templating language like I'm not sure what they use for templating in Python, but it's an ERB. It's similar to EJS that you can use. It also now comes packaged with Webpack, so you can, when you create a new application, you can have it pre-configured to use a React front end or a Vue.js front end or a TypeScript front end. I can't remember the ones. React and Vue are the ones that get used a lot. And it's made up of these core libraries, and out of the box, the active record is the main object relational mapper, and it maps directly to your fields in the database and allows you to interact. It writes SQL for you essentially, right? So you just have to say, user find and the number, or you can say. You can do a lot of commands that it's an abstraction layer from SQL. So you're not writing that much SQL. If you have to write SQL in Rails, it's sort of a one-off usually. You have a special piece of SQL that you need done. The controller layer is obvious. It comes with built-in way to email people with Action Mailer. It comes in now with a job framework. So because it's single-threaded, there are a lot of times things that you want to put in the background and do later, of course. So it allows you to just execute things later. So you put it into a queue, and then it'll execute the job when the system has time to it. So that's really a nice feature. Essentially, you send your emails in the background. You do any major processing of reports, you can do them all in the background. So this single-threaded nature is what led them to come to those sort of those innovations. Now they have an easy way for you to, active storage is this new way where you can upload images and documents, and you can connect it directly to S3 or Azure or Google Storage, and it will sync with those libraries directly. So you just think about it once you upload it, and then it interacts with the different clouds to store your objects. A couple of those because I can show you guys the metaprogramming later. This is kind of the ecosystem as well for Rails, things that are used. You're almost always deployed on a Linux operating system. With the community is big on Postgres, and the framework is tied closely with Postgres in the sense of it also uses all of their NoSQL features. So you can store JSON directly in the Postgres database. You can store arrays. So Postgres has really developed lately as this powerful open source free database that has all the features that are needed. So for most applications, many applications. And these are sort of the storage layer. And then they also utilize Redis for caching and for data storing. So that gives its own topic as well. Nginx is popular, although you can use any web server, and this is Passenger, which is a module on Nginx. So that those kind of often work together in deployments, where you have Nginx serving your assets, any files, any images. It does that sort of.
Well, I was working with Rails last night trying to install it and everything. It keeps hanging about SQLite 3. Is that something you have to use?
You can. Well, in order to use it, you have to install a library. So so on your machine, you might need the SQLite library, and then the gem relies on that library. Same thing with Postgres. There's
Well, the gem keeps hanging on when he tries to build the header files.
Yeah, it's looking for that library on your local machine. Are you using Homebrew or are you using on a Windows?
That's what I was trying. I haven't used my Linux machine. I was trying it on Windows.
Oh, okay.
And I heard read somewhere that the latest version of SQLite, Java, or whatever, breaks on Windows.
Oh, is that right?
But I
That
can't figure out why, so I tried it on the Windows Linux subsystem. People saying, yeah, you can't get past SQLite 3. And I know it's on the machine.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have as much experience with Windows. I almost always use a Linux box or
I'm about thinking I'm just going to go to Linux through Windows.
it makes it a lot easier for a lot of these open source projects to use Ubuntu or.
So basically, this is really should be used in a Linux environment.
It's always almost always deployed to a Linux environment or a Linux container. So it does make sense to. When I really started developing a lot with it, I just got an old Windows machine and installed Ubuntu on it, and then so I'd get used to all the package management and administering a Linux server locally, just to get used to how it works. Because most of the time, it was deployed to a full server. Now, there's this container movement, of course, so it'll probably be a Docker container of a Linux distribution. And that does kind of take us towards the last part, which is where things are headed. And like I was saying, in the past, you had these monolithic applications. They found ways to distribute those and scale them. The last sort of environment that I worked in was similar to this. We had like a bunch of different UIs and then a bunch of different service applications which are talking back and forth to one another. And it was, if we have, like, so now that you have, like, if this is, let's call this a microservice or a service, you know, loosely using the term service-oriented architecture or microservice architecture. Now, in your application layer, you might have one API which is written in C# or is written in Java and deals with your high concurrency issues, deals with if you have some hardcore processing that needs to be done. But now that it's distributed, you know, one team could write the Python app, and this is a Ruby app, and then they all speak REST to one another, and you solve a lot of the issues of. I mean, I've never had an issue with this concurrency thing, but it does come up a lot. I mean, a lot of people talk about it, right? So Ruby really works in this environment. You can, and there's a way through the Rails framework, you can generate now just API only applications. So essentially, if you think of it as a bunch of layers, it takes out all of the extra layers that you might need to render the UI and to like deal with sessions, deal with cookies, and deal with loading static assets, and then you just have a JSON API that you can interact with over REST. So that's a nice way to isolate things. And I can, if we have time later, I can demo some of those, that meta programming, this generation of applications that way. But yeah, how will it work in the new environment? Well, you get to this cloud native, now that's the hot word that people are talking about, and it really means, to me, I see it from the enterprise standpoint, management comes to you and says, hey, if you don't need to use a server, don't use a server, because they don't want to manage infrastructure anymore. They don't want to pay for it. It sits there and runs. There's a ton of waste always. And so if you're able to just build like an API layer through the Amazon API gateway, and then you can run different services. Some of them don't, there's, they have these two different frameworks that are used a lot. These Google Firebase and AWS Amplify is them trying to codify this idea. It's essentially, you're going to write UI code, you're going to write your iOS app or your React front end, and then there'll be a layer of API, and then there'll be a bunch of maybe containers or APIs, and then those interact with different AWS services. Database as a service, table as a service, object storage through S3 or file storage. And so you just reduce the amount of actual servers that ever have to run. In some cases, you still will need some of these guys, right? You'll still need some EC2 instances, but as much as possible, you try to get rid of your servers. And anytime there's something that's already been built, like authentication or authorization, you don't rebuild it because you're on the cloud native environment. You'll just use the services that they have. So it's like Google has their own authentication module that you tie into. AWS has their own authentication module. In this case, it's called Cognito, and then you can create user pools. You all of a sudden have a cloud scale user management and authorization piece. You start to get these. I mean, this is just kind of a random diagram, but we start doing a lot of these, right? Where it's you just your website starts to look like a bunch of services tied together. And why Ruby's good in this environment is it just became a first-class citizen in the serverless world. So the poorly named AWS Lambda is a runtime environment where you can just write a function that gets called on demand. So and they originally did it with JavaScript and Python and one other language, but now you can also run Ruby as a function. So when you have a new web application and you come in through the API and you really want to hit the DB, the database, and get something from your object storage and get something from here, you have these Ruby functions which serve as like glue. You can just say like, okay, go get the file from the object storage, go get the file from the file storage, send an API request to this, send an email, and so Ruby has become, first-class citizen in the serverless world now, and so I think the future is good for Ruby in that way and Rails. So they've dealt with scaling over the last decade with these massive monolithic applications, but now also in the cloud native environment, Ruby also has a good place. It's easy to learn. It's one of the nicest things to read and an expressive place. So these are the best use cases for it in summary. And then I also put in some learning resources. If you guys are interested in learning Ruby and Rails, the Rails guides are great. I like these videos to start off. This Pragmatic Studio is really good. They break everything down really well. They have a lot of great diagrams, and you're able to conceptualize things well, and they take you through actually building an app. And then this guy, Kevin Scoglin on LinkedIn, is really great too.
I've actually been very interested in learning or self-teaching myself Ruby on Rails. So far, I'm currently self-teaching myself R and Python. I kind of want to do it here, but I didn't really want to like spend a few $1,000s on taking another like big course here. But like I'm like really interested in like maybe like self-teaching myself or like buying a Udemy thing if it's on sale. But coming back to my question, have you taken the certification for Ruby? Because it's the first time I've heard about it.
Yeah, it's the first. I actually just heard about it. I think it just came out, or it was recently just published, because I had never heard of it either. And then there's like a weekly Ruby email, and it
Oh, yeah.
came out. It was announced.
I might be interested, maybe like, I mean, not now obviously, but like sometime down the road, maybe taking the silver. It doesn't look terribly difficult.
Yeah, I don't think it's terribly difficult. I think it's a good
Yeah.
starting place. I'm thinking about it as well. Just doing both.
I mean, it might look a little bit intimidating because of the fee though. It's $150 for the test.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I did research. I just did some research on it, but because I was just like really interested in like self-teaching myself Ruby and Ruby on Rails. It's big in the computer science.
Yeah, it's definitely doable.
I just was curious. You told us a lot of the like good reasons why to use Ruby and what you like about it, but would you be able to point out some like the vulnerabilities or limitations that Ruby might have over other
Yeah,
languages?
yeah. I mean, it really comes down to this performance and concurrency issue, and the fact that it uses a lot of RAM. So I mean, maybe it doesn't out of the box use a lot of RAM. I think it does more than other compiled languages. But every time we've had an application in production, you compare it with other application frameworks, and it's burning a lot of RAM. Especially if you do something wrong, right? If you do something stable, like it's really easy to burn a lot of RAM. But then what it comes down to, I mean, Java developers or people, I've talked to some people who work a lot in Java, and they'll refer to it as a toy language. They're like, oh, well, I also do some fun stuff. I like to play around with Ruby or whatever. But it's kind of one of those things of people trying to have bravado or ego or whatever. Or their language is the coolest and the best. I mean, obviously, it is huge. I mean, you can build massively scalable billion-dollar industries with Ruby on Rails, and it's one of the easiest things to learn. One of the most supportive communities. It's not a bad way to go, but it will never be as performant as Java or C#. It'll never have that concurrency unless there are these Ruby interpreters who are trying to do it, and I don't have a ton of experience with those. I've always used the standard interpreter.
You were saying Ruby allows you to have very short, like very quick to market.
Yeah.
And well, I was wondering what makes it so. Is it because of all the libraries that, or is it just the language itself?
Yeah.
Compared to Python, I know a lot of people say Python's pretty
Fast.
easy to use, but
Yeah. Part of it is really that comes down to Rails, because Rails has found this way to it has a lot of code which generates other code, and it has these great conventions, and it's thought through all of the issues that any major application will have to deal with. I mean, I guess so has .NET, so has Django, right? But part of it is, I was thinking if I could do an example here. Like you can do things like, it has these generators. Oh, I need to
Should I close this line though? It's creating, it might create a little bit of a problem with the visibility a little bit.
I'll just use
So if I close these blinds,
it's fun to me, yeah.
there. That works.
Well, it comes with these generators and scaffolding. So you can just say like, we need to build articles, right? So we're going to do columns. So let's just scaffold for an article. Its title is going to be a string, and the body is going to be text, and what would be an integer? Let's just say, I don't know, ranking is an integer. I don't know what that would be. And then you just generate it. It generates all the boilerplate code generates like a database migration, so you can easily then migrate the database and create those fields. You can easily like say, oh, it references the user. It'll create a foreign key on the database and an index. So you're able to just scaffold out your application, just thinking through the different models, thinking through the different pieces of it. And then you have like essentially from that just your admin interface, and then you can get creative with different namespaces for the users or different namespaces for the API. It just, and it allowed, and it's, let me see if I don't know if this app is really going, but let's see. And then that's, and then we can go to, it creates a bunch of restaurants, right? So you can go to articles, create an article. Hello, my name. And it has like a, so then that, you can, it gives you the UI and the model and the controller. And then in the model, it's really easy to say an article has many comments. So then you can create a comment scaffold. So and then it generates the whole thing for the articles, which are like underneath. So it really lends itself to this meta programming idea. That's why a lot of people who work in Rails do sort of move along the architect path, or like you're never the type of person who can figure out how to, or because I mean if you stay in Rails, you're not the type of engineer who's dealing with those intense computing problems. But you were thinking about models all the time, how to organize large code bases, how things should interact. So it definitely is a path that a lot of people go on from you know, developer, programmer, senior programmer, architect, because it lends itself to that kind of programming model.
So, how do you debug it?
Oh, that's another thing I should have mentioned, is it has a built-in, one part of the culture that is also deeply ingrained is test-driven development. So in those scaffolds, it also generates part of a test framework, right? So they have a built-in test system called test unit, but there's also this third party called RSpec, and a lot of people, RSpec's of what we've always used, and many people in the industry use it, but so your core tests that you need, which is like functionally, do these controllers lead to these routes and do they return these different results, are generated, and then you have model tests which are generated, which allows you to test your business logic and the life cycle of the object, and then you have helpers which allow you to test some your decorator type patterns and the ways that you build out your views and logic into your views. So yeah, and a lot of times when you want a job, you need to show that you do test-driven development. So you have to write the test, fail, write the code, then.
So it's basically testing, including code, step in to watch variables or code breaks, put breakpoints in.
You can, yeah, you can. And it comes with a gem. I mean, it comes with part of the gem's called ByBug, which allows you to, at any point, just write. You can raise an exception, or you can have BIBug inspect the environment at that point in time in the code, and then in the middle of execution, it will stop and display what is wrong or what parameters are included in this controller. So it does have that reflective ability to look introspectively at each method and pause it at any point and see what the environment spits out, what's in the session. And they're all objects that you can access, right? So you can access the session object, inspect it. You can access the request object, inspect that.
So if you use an IDE or just strictly don't have editor?
I mostly
Yeah.
use Atom for an editor, and then just the console. That's mostly what I do. People use RubyMine. It's from JetBrains. They make this Java IDE, and they also make a Ruby IDE. But it's so lightweight, you really don't need an IDE. You can just. I run this code watcher that essentially looks at every time code is changed, it runs all the tests associated with that code, called Guard. But it's lightweight enough that you don't need a full IDE, but some people do. So, yeah.
Are there any other frameworks except for Rails, or is that the only game in town?
No, yeah, there's Sinatra is it's the lowest level you can get is it's a rack application. So rack is this standardized interface for any type of HTTP application, and then Rails is built on top of that. Sinatra is the next level of rack, so it's like if you just have something really simple you need to do, and you only need a few routes, and you don't want the whole framework, then you just create a Sinatra app, and it's a few files. And there's a couple others, but not as popular. Sinatra and Rails are the big ones.
Did you say Rails or Ruby is not good for constant harvesting?
Not, yeah,
It's not,
yeah, because it's
unless you write services. Unless you write, like you were showing all the RESTful APIs.
oh yeah. So you can distribute it, right? So it works if you distribute it with many different services, right? And then they can interact through REST, or if you don't need atomic transactions in eventual consistency, there's this idea of eventual consistency in those distributed systems, then you just, every time the services need to interact with each other, you just put it in the queue. So then it goes in the queue, and the other app's listening on the queue, and then when it gets it, it does what it needs to do. But the type of concurrency that I'm trying to think of what would be a good example would be like, you need to process video, right? Or you need to resize it or do multiple concurrent processes on the same machine. Then Ruby, you need a special interpreter for Ruby to do that. And I don't know a lot about those. I mean, there's a JRuby, which is kind of works with Java and allows for that type of concurrency, but it's not that common. And Rubius is another implementation of the interpreter and ways to try to achieve concurrent computing, but that's out of my wheelhouse, really. Yeah, that's not, I'm not too well versed in that.
You mentioned you were working on a project for Verizon. Are you an independent contractor, or are you actually working for Verizon?
So for the last 3 years, I was, actually for the last 5 years, I worked for different middlemen, right? So like Tech Systems or Indotronics was the company that I worked for, and then they have relationships with these different corporations. So you are a W-2 employee for these contract companies, staffing companies. And so then I finished that in December, and now I'm just doing some individual contracting, building some prototypes. But I might go back to Verizon. I'm talking to them. We'll see. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.